In her book, God's Monsters, scholar Esther Hamori points out that composite monsters, that is, monsters made up of the bits of other creatures, were common in ancient mythology because their appearance revealed what their powers are. What better way to show that a creature is as strong as a lion but as smart as a human being than to give them a lion's body with a human head? What better way to show that something is as fierce as any jungle creature than to give it parts of every jungle creature? Far from being lazy or uninspired, composite monsters from the ancient world are visually efficient. Plus, by grouping things together that don't naturally come together, that don't belong, so to speak, composite monsters also arouse disgust and fear. And we're going to appeal to composite monsters and the line between man and beast, or human and beast I should say, in today's adventure. Welcome to PhD&D everyone, I'm Dr. Bowers, and today we're going to explore the Ravenloft Domain of Dread known as Markovia, a seeming island paradise inhabited by what seems to be a good doctor who cares about animals, but which is secretly and clearly inspired by the sinister Doctor Moreau of H.G. Wells' novel. As with all my Ravenloft videos, we'll talk about what this domain is, list some media to help us get an imaginative grip on the domain, and then sketch out an adventure. Our adventure takes place across 3 acts, taking PCs from level 5 through level 7. That is, the PCs will complete the adventure at level 7, and with DM's permission could level up to 8 afterwards. This adventure takes elements from Ghost of Saltmarsh, Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, and Tomb of Annihilation. Before we get started on the adventure, however, what exactly is the domain of Markovia? Well, Dr. František Markov is a genius, but less so than yesterday. His Markov formula grants him unparalleled intellect, but it insidiously steals more than it gives, making him increasingly dull-witted and bestial in form. Despairing, the doctor fled to a tropical island he dubbed Markovia, where he tests new versions of his formula on the local fauna in hopes of recovering his waning genius. As a result of these tests, animals across Markovia now possess sapience and have been deluded into believing Markov is their god. So Markovia is a tropical, jungle-shrouded island full of wild animals, and at its center there's a compound where Dr. Markov lives. Dr. Markov performs all manner of experiments on animals, trying to raise them in sapience and in intelligence and in their capabilities, and he does so specifically in order to discover what might cure his own condition. Now, this is an older Ravenloft Domain of Dread going all the way back to 2nd edition, and in 2nd edition, Dr. Markov had the unusual condition of a human head being fastened to a gorilla body. That is, Dr. Markov would lumber around with an ape's body, with his own head, and he would constantly suffer as a result of not being able to perform surgery as well as he would like, not being able to perform medical research as well as he would like, for his ape-like hands get in the way. Here in 5th edition, it seems as though they've slightly replaced this, saying that Dr. Markov simply gets less and less intelligent each day, but for the sake of fun, I'm going to go with the older Dr. Markov. And to help us get an imaginative grip on that character, as well as the setting, here's some bits of media. First and most obviously, there's the 1896 novel by H.G. Wells, The Island of Doctor Moreau. Markovia is based on the Island of Doctor Moreau in the same way that Barovia is based on Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dr. Markov is an XP of Dr. Moreau. Basically, Dr. Moreau stepped out of this book and placed in a Ravenloft domain. It's a short read, very influential, and obviously recommended if you're going to run this Domain of Dread in any depth. There's also the 1917 piece by Franz Kafka, A Report to an Academy. This is a strange and somewhat humorous piece about an ape who's learned to speak and learned to become human. The ape describes this process to an academic audience at a university, and it concludes with the sad and somewhat tragic fact that the ape is no longer able to even imagine what it was like before he was a human being, can no longer identify with members of his kind, and so forth. Scholars have pointed out that this piece may contain metaphors for things like assimilation and national identity and the like, but even without the symbolism, it's a fascinating little read. There's also Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 film, The Birds. It's an excellent horror film, especially if you're looking for inspiration about intelligent animals. Animals that are more intelligent than they should be, and also more aggressive and deadly than they should be. The Birds is about, well, birds. You'd think that that wouldn't be too scary, but in fact it's one of the more suspenseful and horrifying films I've ever seen. Highly recommended if you're thinking about what the denizens of Markovia would be like. And speaking of crossing the line between humanity and beast, I also recommend Pierre Boulle's novel, The Planet of the Apes, and the 1968 film that was based on that novel. They're both excellent. The novel is a quick read, it has some interesting twists that you can't find in any cinematic adaptation, and I must say the 68 film is just a masterpiece of cinema. Directed by Franklin Schaffner, and with a script written by none other than the Rod Serling of The Twilight Zone, it also has a soundtrack by Jerry Goldsmith. Plus, there's the then groundbreaking prosthetic makeup and the set design. An excellent source if you want to imagine how the animal people or the hybrids of Dr. Markovia might talk and interact and think of human beings. That is, human beings who are not Dr. Markov. There's also Season 7, Episode 19 of Star Trek The Next Generation, an episode called Genesis, directed by Gates McFadden. That's right, Beverly Crusher. In this episode, the crew of the Enterprise are infected with a kind of genetic disorder which causes them to de-evolve and adopt and grow various animal traits. Surprisingly scary and surprisingly suspenseful, it does fit squarely into the theme that we're exploring with today's domain, so check that out too. I also recommend the 2014 Polish film White God. This is an amazing and also a heart-wrenching watch about dogs who escape from captivity. I mean domesticated dogs who escape from captivity, form an army, and lay siege to a Polish town. I say heart-wrenching because the dogs are effectively taking revenge for being mistreated, and some of that mistreatment is portrayed on the camera as well. It's an amazing film, but know that going in. I should add that no actual dogs or other animals were harmed in the making of the movie, fortunately. I must also recommend the 2022 novel, The Daughter of Doctor Moreau by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is an amazing read. I'm really glad that a friend recommended it to me, because it's a retelling of the Island of Doctor Moreau, but with a lot more cultural depth and social commentary and tension. The novel goes back and forth between two point-of-view characters, and it becomes clear very, very quickly that in this version, Dr. Moreau is not designing animal hybrids just for the sake of accomplishment, or just for the sake of being able to do it. No, he's got corporate backers who want him to create a docile, obedient workforce. The novel discusses issues of slavery and labor exploitation, colonialism, national identity, and more. And, like the rest of the works by Silvia Moreno Garcia, it's absolutely a treat. There's also Paul Tremblay's epic free verse poem, The Beast You Are. It can be found in a compilation book of the same name, and it is also a fascinating piece about an animal hybrid society. It's not exactly one that matches what you'd find in Markovia, but it is full of a lot of interesting ideas about how animal-people hybrids would behave. What kind of society they would build, and how just because they're cute animal people doesn't mean that their world isn't utterly bleak. I recommend Paul Tremblay's work in general, and this is no exception. Some people also like the cinematic adaptation of The Island of Doctor Moreau from the 90s, starring Val Kilmer and Marlon Brando. I would agree that that film is very striking, has some really awesome visual aesthetics. The story about the making of the film is utterly bizarre and fascinating, but it's certainly a niche watch. I don't hate the film or anything like that, but I do agree that there's a reason why it's regularly panned as a subpar achievement. You do get the inspiration for Mini-Me, though. And finally, there's the 1995 second edition Ravenloft adventure Neither Man Nor Beast, written by Jeff Grubb, which is set on the island of Markovia. The adventure loosely runs the players through the Island of Doctor Moreau, the story, and it adds a couple of embellishments to make it a bit more adventuresome. We're going to adapt this older piece for today's adventure. And speaking of which, let's talk about this. As I mentioned, our adventure takes place in 3 parts, or 3 acts. The PCs begin Act 1 at level 5, where they are washed ashore on the island of Markovia, either because their ship has wrecked or because they were tossed into the sea and luckily washed up on the beaches there. They discover a pirate's hideout with only a couple of delusional survivors who rant and rave about a god that walks who gives magical powers to animals. And sure enough, later that evening, the PCs are approached by a deer who talks, threatens them, discusses the god who walks, or as they call him, Dies Ambulet, and who, with fellow deer and birds, attack the PCs. In the wake of the attack, the pirate camp is no longer a viable hideout, and so the PCs must head into the jungle to search for help and maybe a means of escape. In Act 2, at level 6, the PCs can either proceed in one direction and eventually encounter Dr. Markov's compound, or they can proceed in a different direction and encounter the ruins of an ancient monastery presided over by an order of undead monks called the Brethren. These two parties are locked in an opposition. The Brethren hold a certain artifact that Dr. Markov wants, called the Table of Life. Dr. Markov is willing to do anything to get it, and the Brethren are willing to do anything to keep him from getting it. Depending on which direction the PCs choose and which party they meet first, the adventure can unfold in a few different ways. Eventually, it becomes clear what each party wants and what each party is asking the PCs to do, at which point they level up, and we proceed to the third act, where they are level 7. And in Act 3, at level 7, there is a full-scale assault on Dr. Markov's compound by the Brethren, as well as a rebellious group of beasts that Dr. Markov could not control. The PCs partake in this battle, but at its conclusion, regardless of whose side they're on, Dr. Markov's estate is up in flames, Dr. Markov himself appears dead, and the adventure comes to a close. So let's set this thing out in detail. As I mentioned, in Act 1, the PCs are level 5. They wash ashore on Markovia, either because their ship was wrecked on nearby rocks, or because they fell or were tossed overboard and washed ashore by stormy currents. In the nearby lagoon, a few broken ships, too damaged to be of any use, bob and drift in the seawater. Meanwhile, a ramshackle tower rises from a plateau on the shore, accompanied by a network of rickety bridges that connect it to a few small caves. Should the PCs explore, they meet a couple of delusional pirates, one of them a cook, who rant and rave about how the animals are cursed here. The animals can talk and think and plan. Some of them can cast magic. And the pirates' number has slowly been dwindling with every animal attack. The pirates swear that they are in the domain of a god who walks around and gives sentience and sapience and abilities to the beasts. Now, for this area, and for a map specifically, we're going to use Jahaka Anchorage from Tomb of Annihilation. We're going to remove 2 of the pirates, leave the remaining pirate and the cook, and replace the Deinonychus with a tethered and muzzled dire wolf. The pirate survivors have captured the dire wolf and tried to interrogate it, but it doesn't cooperate and they don't like hearing it talk, so they've muzzled it and chained it up. Should the PCs build a fire and spend the night in this pirate camp, they are soon approached by a deer, a large elk, who stands at the very edge of their firelight and watches them for several moments. The PCs might attempt an animal handling check, or they might attempt to cast Speak with Animals. But either way, the elk will begin speaking to them in common. The elk mutters forebodingly about a god who walks. Dies Ambulet is what the god is called. Dies Ambulet, the god that walks. The deer warns that the PCs trespass in this god's domain, and that the punishment is death. You should give the PCs a few moments to try to reason with the elk or ask it a couple of questions. This is a really cool setup, and you don't want to just blow through it real fast. But after a few minutes, the deer and several other deer, who all have the statistics of lucrotas, attack, along with some wild birds from the jungle who have the statistics of sturges. They descend on the PCs and attack, fighting to the death because they believe that they are serving a holy cause. The whole time during the fight, you should let these beasts talk. These beasts should talk to the PCs, taunt them, repeat that they are trespassing in the realm of a god and that there is no hope, that death must be their punishment, that it is the sacred way, it is the sacred law. They should say all kinds of ominous things like that and stay in conversation. Also, be sure that you describe these animals as more or less ordinary deer. They might be a bit more muscular, they might have a couple of odd features like human-looking eyes or something, but part of the reason why this scene is disturbing is that they're ordinary deer. Deer don't ordinarily attack people. These ones do, though. What's going on? At the battle's conclusion, the PCs are free to finish their rest, but other deer and birds have completely devastated what remains of the pirate camp, freeing the direwolf and killing the pirate and the cook. It's clear that the PCs cannot stay here, and so they level up to 6 and must head further into the jungle. Now in Act 2, at level 6, the PCs are trekking through the jungle, and they encounter a couple of groups of wild animals. These wild animals will taunt and warn the PCs, again repeating this language about Dies Ambulet, the god who walks, and the severe nature of the PCs' trespass. One of these encounters occurs on a bridge that spans over a deep and wide gorge. There are monkeys and apes in the trees who are as disposed towards the PCs as the other animals have been, and for a map we're going to use Atayez Muhaha from Tomb of Annihilation. This is a lovely little set piece with a stone bridge spanning over a huge gorge, and a lot of opportunities for close calls and scrapes and saves. as animals outright attack the PCs or try to forbid their crossing. After the location, for which we're using the map of Atea's Muhaha, the PCs can go either north or south. To the north lies the cabin and the compound of Dr. Markov. To the south, however, lies an ancient temple ruin, populated by undead monks called the Brethren, along with a few rebellious animals, which Dr. Markov has endowed with intelligence, but who have ceased to worship him. It's up to the PCs to choose a direction, and depending on which direction they take, the adventure could go in a couple of different, directions. If they head north, they find that Dr. Markov's compound includes a large cabin, a large barn where animals are kept, and of course, a small field for some crops that they grow and subsist on. For the cabin, we're going to use the map of the Hermitage from Tamarat's Fate in Ghosts of Saltmarsh, but we're going to fill its interior with different things, not nautical equipment, but other things more appropriate to what Dr. Markov is up to. Dr. Markov's cabin has, of course, a lab for doing scientific research, a library full of books, a painting studio, a master bedroom, servants' quarters, and also, curiously, a room full of children's toys and educational materials, like reading primers, even though there are no children at the compound. Now, should the PCs head here, Dr. Markov immediately introduces himself and welcomes the PCs as guests, inviting them to stay for as long as they'd like. If asked about the strange and hostile beasts, Dr. Markov will apologize. He says that the animals are afflicted with some kind of bizarre natural condition, and because of his interactions with them, they have started to worship him as a god. He's studying them and trying to understand what's wrong with them, but he actually has nothing to do with their condition, is what he says. He's of course lying to the PCs. Every animal on the island has sentience and capabilities because Markov has experimented on them. In addition, Dr. Markov has a bulky body with extra long arms. He stoops and lumbers about because it's actually the body of a gorilla. He does everything possible to conceal this fact, claiming he was born that way, and wearing clothes that cover his whole body at all times, even his hands, which he always keeps covered with surgical gloves. He says his name is Dr. Fran, and if asked about the name of the island, he chuckles and says he was thinking of naming it after himself. Maybe he'll call it France. Even as the PCs stay in the compound and enjoy resting and taking meals with Dr. Markov, however, they should soon notice that something is amiss. First, Dr. Markov has two servants, a butler named Mling, and a woman who Dr. Markov claims is his daughter, named Felicia. Both of these servants wear face masks, or masks covering the lower part of their face, and they don't speak too often, mostly just replying in monosyllables and doing whatever Markov bids silently. At separate times during the evening, however, in fact, late in the evening, each of these servants leaves the compound, and if the PCs follow either one of them, they find that the servant takes off all of their clothes, strips naked, and begins hunting wild creatures as if they were a beast. And when these servants strip down, the PCs can see that they have animalistic features, tails and muzzles and fangs and claws and fine layers of fur and more. This should, at the very least, suggest that not all is what it seems. And if the PCs interrupt such hunting rituals, the servants beg the PCs not to tell Dr. Markov. They offer to tell the truth about what's going on the island. They just don't want the PCs to reveal that they have been misbehaving, since they're actually not allowed to go hunting. Dr. Markov has forbade them from hunting because he wants them to live as civilized, non-bestial creatures, a feat that they just cannot achieve. The jungle and the hunt, it calls to them. We'll say that Mling has a hybrid body of bear, human, and ape, and that Felicia has a hybrid body of panther, jaguar, and human. The PCs might also notice that the room intended for children, that's full of toys and reading primers, it's utterly filthy. Most of the toys are broken, a lot of the reading primers are ripped up, and there's animal fur, just shed animal fur everywhere. This too may raise some suspicions, especially since there aren't any children on the compound. What are these toys for? If asked, Dr. Markov will say that he's always wanted children, but unfortunately has never had an opportunity other than his daughter Felicia, whose complete parentage he does not reveal. In fact, of course, Felicia is not really his daughter, just another scientific creation of his. There's also the fact that Markov's barn, where animals are kept, contains a surgical table, as well as surgical tools and a whole lot of medical equipment. Markov might claim it's for innocent research, but it's one more thing that the PCs might be suspicious about. There's also Markov's painting studio, which features a number of frightful depictions of human-animal hybrids, as well as a very disturbing landscape painting that shows Dr. Markov's compound in flames. If asked about it, Dr. Markov says it's a recurring nightmare, and he also dismisses the paintings of human-animal hybrids as recurring nightmares, even though they're very realistic. And finally, if nothing else raises the PC's suspicions, they might notice that his lab contains a number of humanoid brains preserved in jars in formaldehyde, and after the PCs have stayed a night or two, they might notice that a number of empty jars have been added to the shelf, jars that feature the PC's names, and that carries a very foreboding implication. So there's lots of spooky stuff and suspicious stuff that the PCs can do if they head north towards Markov's compound. If the PCs head south, however, they encounter a ruin, the ruins of a monastery and a cemetery, and it's populated by a group of undead monks. These monks wear hooded robes and try to conceal the fact that they're undead, and they're actually quite friendly, if a little bit drab and bland in the way that they act. They don't deny being undead, but they also don't readily bring it up or bring any attention to it. Each monk has the statistics of a revenant, and they are led by a monk named Brother Ignacio. Initially, the monks welcome the PCs, treat them like guests, but eventually ask the PCs for help. They reveal that, from time to time, some of their number become feral and monstrous. When they do, they leave the monastery and join an ever-growing band of ravenous, monstrous monks. These monks gather in the nearby cemetery, having taken it over, and occasionally stage attacks on the monastery. They ask the PCs to help save them from this onslaught, to go into the cemetery and, well, clear it out of monstrous monks. They also reveal that the monstrous monks have stolen a powerful magical artifact, one which cannot fall into the wrong hands. This artifact is called the Table of Life. And it is indeed powerful. The Table of Life is a marble slab that always hovers about 3 feet off the ground, and its power is this: anyone who lies on the Table of Life cannot die, or at least for as long as they're on the table. When somebody is lying on the table, they will survive anything: drowning, asphyxiation, dismemberment, burning, whatever, they will survive. Plus, they won't age. It's only after somebody leaves the Table of Life, having laid down on it once, that their age will catch up to them, that the wounds will catch up to them and become lethal if they would have been lethal to begin with, and so on. Legend has it that some amateur wizards attempted to live forever on the Table of Life, but after a few centuries, accidentally rolling over in one sleep onto the floor results in them collapsing into a skeleton. If asked, the monks will confirm that yes, there is a scientist on this island who has been experimenting on the animals and granting them the gifts of sapience and other powers usually reserved for humanoids. They call this scientist by his name, Dr. Markov, and warn that Dr. Markov is trying to get the Table of Life. If he gets it, not only is there no limit on the amount of torture he will wreak on the bodies of his experiments, but the reach of those experiments will escalate to sinister levels. The Table of Life must not fall into Dr. Markov's hands. The PCs must go into the cemetery, dispatch the monstrous monks who hold it, and bring the Table of Life back to the Brethren so they can continue guarding it and keeping it safe. Now, for a map of the ancient monastery, we'll use High Hall Cathedral from Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. Just change every PC into a friendly revenant, and of course eliminate any mention about Elturel or Elturel going into Avernus or anything like that. As for where the monstrous monks are located, use the Grand Cemetery, again from Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. Keep everything the same, but replace the pair of Mesoloths with a pair of ghosts, and replace the 4 Dretches with 4 skeletons. Also, replace the Demon Portal with the Table of Life, and get rid of Ulder Ravengard. We don't need him here. And so, after the PCs have either traveled to Markov's compound and learned what they can learn there, or after the PCs have headed south to the ruined monastery and cleaned out the cemetery of monstrous monks there, the PCs level up to 7, and we proceed to Act 3. In Act 3, if the PCs are staying with Dr. Markov, he tells them about the Table of Life. He lies about its nature, however, referring to it as the Table of Healing, and describing its powers in a more benevolent way. He says that it's a curative artifact that can heal any disease, repair any wound, and that, as a man of medicine, it would be a boon to his purpose. He tells the PCs of a horrible ruined monastery full of monstrous undead monks who viciously hold and guard the Table of Life against all reason. He asks the PCs to travel to that monastery, dispatch all the monks, all of them, and return with the Table of Life. For the greater good, of course. If the PCs refuse, or if they're already wise to Dr. Markov's schemes and they seem hesitant, Dr. Markov will excuse himself and then quickly summon a group of servants, animal hybrids that he has engineered himself. These include jackalwares, lamias, and medusas, who attack the PCs in huge numbers, trying to drive them off of the compound. You can have wave after wave of these monsters show up while Dr. Markov is hidden. It's not only Dr. Markov's goal, but your goal as a DM to get the PCs off of the compound until the conclusion of the adventure. If they were inclined to help Dr. Markov, they just need to leave the compound and go to the monastery, and if they weren't inclined to help Dr. Markov, they should still leave and go to the monastery to find out what's really going on here. Meanwhile, if the PCs have been staying with the undead monks this whole time, those monks urge the PCs, now that the cemetery is cleared out, to help stage an attack on Dr. Markov's compound. Since the cemetery is cleared out, they can even spare a few of their numbers to accompany the PCs and help with the attack. And indeed, if the PCs fled Dr. Markov's compound after already deciding that he was a villain, they can find allies in these monks. Now, regardless of the details, one of two things is going to happen. Either the PCs return to assault Markov's compound, with or without the help of undead monks, or else the PCs return to Markov's compound with the Table of Life. Either way, Markov summons more minions to defeat and capture the PCs, hoping to conduct experiments on them, and he too fights bitterly, nearly to the death, with the statistics of a Silver Quill Professor of Shadow from Strixhaven Curriculum of Chaos. The battle is fierce, you might want to give Markov a legendary action or two, or legendary resistance. And at some point during the battle, the compound catches fire and begins to burn, with wooden boards and thatched roofs under the tropical sun is going to flare up rather quickly, and the PCs must flee. As they do, the last thing they see looking back is the compound in flames, exactly as it was depicted in Dr. Markov's painting, accompanied by a chorus of human and bestial animal screams. As for what happens next, well, that's up to you. Does Dr. Markov recover and stage revenge? Or does a cloud of mist roll in, whisking the PCs fortunately or unfortunately to another domain of dread? I'll let you decide. But that's our adventure in Markovia. What do you think? Did I stay too close to the text of the 2nd edition adventure Neither Man Nor Beast? Would you have done things differently? Maybe make it a little less obvious that this is the Island of Doctor Moreau? Let me know in the comments. And before we bring this video to a close, please listen to the following. 5 Acts The King in Yellow RPG is on Kickstarter, and it only has 10 days left to go. We're very close to hitting our goal, but we really need help. In fact, this channel needs your help. As you know, I do not have a Patreon, I do not ask for money in these videos that I put out, and I haven't monetized my videos. There should be no ads. If you ever see an ad with one of my videos, you should feel free to skip it, because it's not doing any help to me, and I didn't ask it to be there. But the one thing that you can do to help this channel out, please, is to pledge on our Kickstarter. Get a copy of 5 Acts The King in Yellow RPG. Preferably a physical copy, because it's a beautiful 200+ page book in hardcover that includes original rules about storytelling and horror role-playing, as well as lore about Carcosa, the King in Yellow, Hastur, and other associated ideas. And it'll have the original King in Yellow stories in there, plus some original stories, including stuff written by me. And that's to say nothing about the brilliant and beautiful artwork of Mel Williams and Sam Fontaine, which are all throughout on its pages. And again, I must stress, there is a very limited time here. Do not wait, do not miss the deadline, don't let this go past. Please grab a copy of this amazing book, this amazing original TTRPG. If you want to know more about it, I'll put links to various interviews I've done with Really Dicey and Games with Dave and podcasts like that down in the doobly-doo. But seriously, go to the Kickstarter and pledge. Pledge your forces to Carcosa and the Yellow Sign. Survive your nightmares, conquer the world, and I'll see you in the next video.